Hi, I'm Steve Hayes, and I've been asked to answer a few questions that were kicked off by my book, A Liberated Mind, and I'm pleased to be able to do that. So let me just get right to it. I have two questions here that kind of go together. Can you have bad values? What if chosen values are harmful? And how do we find our true values? From an ACT perspective, values are not simply preferences. They're not goals. They're not wants, desires, or that kind of thing. They're chosen qualities of being and doing. They're the embrace of a quality that is intrinsic to your actions as being of importance. And it requires a set of skills to actually do that. You can do values work at any point, but really to do it fully requires emotional openness, because values are the areas where you often hurt and avoid. It requires being able to let go of judgment, step back from your thoughts, because analytic judgmental values are not what we're talking about, and what we mean by choice is selecting among alternatives without the domination of verbal formulations, of reasons, and if-then descriptions. So they're before that, they're choices, and so on. So you have to have a certain amount of psychological flexibility to begin with to fully make values choices. Now, I do believe that it's possible that people may do all of those things and make values choices that you or I would look at and say are not the kind of ones that we want to be affiliated with, that might even say we're evil. Well, I believe that that can occur. I have to tell you that I've not yet met people who make those kind of choices. I have worked with rapists and murderers. My training began in federal penitentiaries. And yes, I've had people say, I just want to hurt people and things like that. But then as I work on their emotional openness and on their sense of yearning for belonging, this more observing sense of self, as I work on attentional flexibility, as I bring the person more fully into their own body and more open to their own history, there seems to be a natural extension of that, from acceptance to compassion, and from diffusion to really being interested in understanding the other person's point of view, from connecting with your own sort of observing self to being able to connect in consciousness with others. And so, if you think about it, good values, I think, are very often those that have a quality of being pro-social, of being concerned with the group, being concerned with the good of others, and that seems to happen naturally as the other flexibility processes occur. Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this. I may meet somebody tomorrow who wants to work with me, who has values I cannot support, and if that happens, I will refer them elsewhere. But I have to tell you, so far that's not happened. Not when I've had a little bit of time to work with the person. I've told this story before, but I'm thinking of a person who was in a 28-day addiction program, who was all tatted up and wearing leathers and chains, and when we went around the room and asked in an ACT group what the person really cared about, he stood up and made his fingers look like a gun and said, "I just don't want anybody to F with me, and if you do, this is what you're going to get." And it wasn't one or two sessions later, after we'd done diffusion work and acceptance work, and we came back and we did a similar exercise. The person stood up and said what they wanted to be about, and he said, "What I really want to be about is being a good dad, and I've been a terrible one inside my addiction," and he started to cry. So I don't know. I mean, I would rather It's like Pascal's wager, I would rather bet that there's a caring human being in there until we're really forced to believe otherwise. Now, in terms of the issue of true values, I think that's kind of a mistake. Walk towards values choices that are made openly without defense between you and the person in the mirror. They could change. Very often they tend to be relatively stable, but they could change. And if you force, what's the real one? The metaphor that Kelly Wilson used, that's rather alike. It's like, designing a house, and then you're sitting in the house and you say, yeah, but is this my real house? Well, if it's not the house that you would want to be in, change the house. And so values, when you make them as a sort of leap of faith choice way, always has a wholeness to it. And it doesn't mean that it can't change, but it does mean that you're trusting yourself as a whole person, that your deep desires, wishes, choices are valid. And if they change, they change. But, which the right one, the true one, the correct one, the good and bad one is really kind of mind chatter about how to be a good boy. Now, we do have spiritual and religious traditions that will give scriptural basis and training and, for what is a good value and what isn't. But in every religion of which I'm aware, that last little part is required. You have to choose it. It may be offered to you by God in a faith tradition, by Scripture in that tradition, but you have to affirmatively choose it. You have to make that leap. So I think our wisdom traditions, our spiritual traditions, and what the science of psychological flexibility points towards are kind of lining up in a relatively consistent way. I'm asked a kind of a geeky question here. How do you use these three types of rule-governed behavior in your practice? Do you do some kind of psychoeducation, make clients aware of which functional classes they're embracing? And the three are this pliance, tracking and augmenting, doing things for the approval of others, doing things just to track contingencies, doing things because they're of importance, because of these kind of motivative choices that are made. All of these technical terms that are in the ACT work are primarily there for therapists and scientists. They're not primarily there for normal people. People didn't come to us wanting to be trained to think like engineers, like behavioral scientists. And so I'm trying to think of, have I ever actually deliberately walked through this three-part rule-governed behavior system with clients in a technical way? No, I have used it to understand really what the hooks are, what the motivation is, and I guess I have talked about in other ways about the importance of really watching your own experience to see whether or not your thoughts line up with what it is that these thoughts say they're supposed to produce. That's a tracking question. If you follow this rule, do you get what the rule says? The values choices are an augmental question. What is of importance? What is the consequence that you're seeking? And looking for those natural, intrinsic consequences that are built into behavior itself is part of the values work that we do. So I have talked about those things, absolutely, probably not very often with those technical terms, but they're in the back of my mind. And, very often if somebody comes in early on in therapy, I think I'm looking at somebody who's simply complying or is fused with a rule that says that these particular consequences should come if you do them, and yet the experience is that they don't. And so you're applying problem solving, it doesn't work, but you keep doing it because you don't know what else to do. And those are kind of untestable tracks, the last one, or what are called pliance or plies, pliance-based rules in the former case. What's your opinion of psychedelic-assisted therapy? Well, I have quite a positive opinion of it. it's the mediators, the functionally important pathways of change in psychedelically assisted therapy appear to be psychological flexibility processes or their close cousins. And in fact, ACT is a psychotherapeutic approach that is very widely used in the West to structure psychedelically assisted therapy. The chemicals don't do the work alone. I mean, in every indigenous culture, there's a rationale, and there's people who help people along the journey and so forth, and you make sure that it's done in a safe place, but it's for a purpose, and it appears as though ACT can really be well used for that. And when you look at things like oceanic awareness that seems to correlate with positive outcomes, that's very, very close to this transcendent sense of self. I, you, here, there, now, then, this place where the I, you, here, there, now, then relationships break down, and there's an expansion across perspective-taking frames. And so changes in values, changes in acceptance, a sense of healthy distance from judgmental thoughts, so forth, those are all in the literature already in psychedelically assisted therapy. So knock on wood, I would like to do it in a sane way, one step at a time. Now, I'm a child of the 60s, and I do have to admit to a certain amount of trepidation. I was there on Hippie Hill in the Summer of Love in San Francisco. I lived in the panhandle of San Francisco for a couple of months one summer. So I saw the good and bad of that. And I'm not very interested in having us redo the 60s and 70s. Because it very quickly went from the Summer of Love to the Summer of dog poop and addicts lying on the sidewalk with needles in the gutter. I mean, that was a train wreck, and some of my friends didn't make it out of that era alive. So I'm not interested in that, and I hope we're able to put something that's more sane and more healthy. And what I would suggest is that we do it by really carefully ensuring that any use of psychedelics that is for a health benefit includes a requirement of the proper sort of behavioral science wraparound to make sure that it's successful. And ACT can be used for that. Unfortunately, the way our medical and healthcare system is set up, it's very hard to ensure that. In many countries, you can easily write a prescription for a medication, but it's really harder to write a behavioral prescription for how that should be delivered or used. And we've seen that in areas like anti-smoking medications that are validated with behavioral counseling plus the use of the medications, and next thing you know, people are just writing the scripts. And then when you look at the research, the effect sizes are cut in, by 75%. I mean, it almost makes the whole thing an empty ritual, and then people end up on dangerous medications with side effects for a long term, and lives are not bettered. So let's not make that mistake, and let's work really hard to make sure that it delivers the good for human beings. But I'm cautiously enthusiastic, and work with teams around the world and trying to use ACT to help the benefits. What are your experience with cultural adaptations of ACT when interventions are effective? For example, in the American cultural context, are there things that can be harmful in European, African, or Asian contexts? We do know that psychological flexibility relates to health outcomes across virtually every language community in which it's ever been examined, and by now we're up to about 25 different language communities around the world. The strength of that relationship is actually quite stable. The degree to which different cultures encourage different aspects of psychological flexibility do vary, and there's certain features that vary a lot. Like some languages don't talk about sense of self in an I-you frame, they do talk about it in terms of an us-them frame, and so that needs to be adjusted. When I'm dealing with cultural adaptations, what I ask of the ACT community is that there be a native language speaker who's really well ACT trained to try to find culturally appropriate metaphors and exercises that fit the cultural tradition. They're often drawn from the stories and from the spiritual and wisdom traditions. And so, for example, ACT is having a very big impact in the Islamic world, and in part because there are such clear connections between ACT and ideas that are written about extensively by the Prophet in the Holy Quran. Now, I could not write those protocols. I could not make that connection. I am trying to read the Quran. But it's an area of Abrahamic religion that was not part of my background. I'm much stronger in the Judeo-Christian side. And so I'm trying to educate myself a little bit, but mostly I'm trying to empower people in the contextual behavioral science or ACT community to use examples, metaphors, exercises, stories, etc., that really fit functionally, not just topographically, what the core processes of psychological flexibility are. It turns out you can do that in every major religion. I've done a book on ACT and pastoral counseling and clerical care where we've asked people to do that with Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity and so forth. And you can do it. The scriptural quotes are there. And I think that's because people are people, and all cultures have been working on mental and behavioral health for their entire existence, and especially in their deeper philosophical and wisdom tradition areas, and especially of those in the ones that touch on mystical and spiritual matters. So far, there's no evidence of harm, but there could be. I mean, I'll give you an example. Let's say, take the issue of values. In a more collectivist culture, things like family values are going to be much more dominant than more individualistic values. But if you look at how ACT walks through the issue of values, they really are empowering of the personal choices of the people that we're working with. And so while you want to know how to ask those questions, to elicit that information, you don't want to make any assumptions. And as I say, you want to use culturally adaptive metaphors and stories that fit the real point you're going after. I don't think the scientific model so far has had to be adjusted in the basics of how language and cognition alters how direct contingency and other ancient learning processes are working, in part because, in my opinion, the ACT work is based on enough really basic work that is all the way down to the level of what is a symbol, what is a word, what is language anyway, and doesn't start with, a white Western set of, virtues, or with a particular way that people need to be in order to be healthy. We will know more about that when we see even more research than we already have, but I will point out that of the almost 450 randomized controlled trials of ACT, there are about 125 or something that comes out of the developed Western world. Very strong presence in the Islamic world, for example. There's 40, 50 randomized trials, maybe more than that, from Iran. A strong presence in China and Asia and Japan, and growing. And so, knock on wood, let's see. I would like to have a better theory of cultural adaptation, because I don't want to just get caught up in the form and the particular words and things like that. That to me looks, I don't know, I don't want to be too critical, but it looks to me like it isn't where we should end up scientifically. We should have a deeper understanding of why cultural differences make a difference. And I think we can do that, actually, inside some of the basic ideas that are underneath ACT, using relational frame theory, looking at how language structure works within that particular community, then adjusting to that. So you would have to know that you know, in Japanese, for example, you shouldn't be talking about IU primarily. That's not the main feature of it. So I myself, what I'm doing is trying to ask questions and to listen well. And so when when mindfulness began to become important, there was very little in the ACT literature on mindfulness until the 2000s. You know, I sought out some help from a very well-known Zen master who was interested in ACT. Amasami is his name, actually. He's an 85-year-old Indian Zen master and a Jesuit priest. And I've done that with other areas, with Native American populations, with indigenous populations around the world, of trying to just ask and empower. And sometimes I've been successful even with publishers. I've told them, yeah, go ahead, you can translate the book, but I want those metaphors translated functionally, not literally. I want somebody who really knows well to come up with a metaphor that really fits that particular culture. Boy, do they fight me on that. And I just fight back, and I don't always win, but because they bought the rights, and so they can do what they want. But so we'll see over time as we get even more diversity than we have in terms of the range of studies on psychological flexibility, on relational frame theory, and the elements of ACT drawn from different peoples around the world, and we'll see what kind of adjustments we need to make. What are the limitations of ACT? Well, the biggest one, I think, is you have to be ready to do it. We do have data on moderators. We know that it tends to be relatively better than other evidence-based treatments when we're dealing with chronic and multi-problem patients, people with at least 2 or more problems. But if somebody's really interested and excited and wants to do it, I think ACT can be helpful even with single problems, even early problems and small problems. But I used to say, and I kind of still believe it, that you don't want to do ACT unless somebody is, we used to use in the lab the word toasted, meaning that life had sort of, put a golden brown on both sides of, if you know what I mean, that you'd been in the oven of pain and difficulty enough to really want to do something as basic as, well, who am I anyway, and what is emotion, and how do thoughts work, and what are my values? Those are pretty basic questions. And so if you have a single phobia, let's say, I'm not sure I myself would be wanting to use ACT with it. But I think, especially as things move forward into a process-based era, the kind of things that I've written about in Liberated Mind, you can really open up and look at what are different methods of moving some of these underlying processes, and whether or not they have the ACT brand name or not really doesn't matter. And so let's not think of this as kind of living inside a cocoon or a cage or a prison or something. ACT is better thought of as a model than as a technology, and so let's focus on the processes and use the methods that actually move them. And so traditional ACT protocols and techniques, I think, there's some, overall, if you look at all the meta-analyses, maybe there's a small effect, Cohen's D of 0.15 or 2, compared to evidence-based therapies, and in some of the analyses, none. It tends to be more of a difference where ACT folks have had a long time to work on it. Like smoking, for example. It looks like an ACT smoking app can beat the best consensus app out of mainstream CBT. But, although we've been around a while, we haven't had the big, it's so broad, and we haven't had the big grants that have allowed us over a period of 10, 20 years to actually dial it in. So right now, I think the main strength of ACT is the breadth of the model and the fact that skills that you learn in one area you can apply in other areas, and that's a huge benefit. We know more about the processes of change, I think, than any other psychotherapy method. But let's not, have the ACT tattoo. We can use methods drawn from humanistic, existential, analytic, cognitive behavioral, and purely behavioral, etc. areas, but we can still apply the psychological flexibility model to help guide that. What important is there to discover within basic and applied research in ACT therapy? Oh golly, a lot. I think there's a lot about how to move these processes in the most efficient way. More about what are the contexts and moderators in which those processes are of importance. How to measure the processes beyond some of our early self-report instruments. How to apply it to the individual more than to a collective. Most research has still been driven by here's the diagnostic group and here's the randomized trial, but really processes can only, I believe, be understood as a pathway of an individual, and then when you have collections of people with the same pathway, then you can make nomothetic subsets. You can say, here are the subsets that go together, but we've adopted in psychometrics, group comparison designs, traditional statistics, traditional mediational analysis, and area to area to area. We've left the psychological level of analysis and we've adopted a more sociological one in ways that I think are statistically, intellectually, practically unwise or even invalid. I've written some about that, and taking a process-based focus really sort of sobers you up as to how far away we are from a good kind of ideographic to nomothetic, what my colleagues and I have recently been calling idionomographic, research that starts with the individual and then clusters to the collective without ever leaving the validity of what's at the individual level. So you never use the individual as an error term. You never look at variability between people within a group as your measure as whether or not you've made something happen. Now this is kind of geeky stuff, and it was a kind of a geeky question, but I would say we need a lot more information as how to take what behavioral science is giving us, this small set of processes that do this huge number of things, and being able to dial it into the individuals that we actually serve, and so coming up with measures, models, and links to methods that allow us to do that, including the basic work, and getting beyond merely self-report. Way too much focus on that is part of what I think will happen over the next 20 years. How does observing one's thoughts and not following them, or any personal phenomena called diffusion in ACT, differ from noticing automatic thoughts being the first step of therapeutic work in CBT? Very closely allied. The original name for ACT was comprehensive distancing, and Beck's name for that step was distancing. Why was it called comprehensive distancing? It sounded dissociative, so we got rid of it and adopted ACT, after we'd got it fully developed. But for the first, 8, 9, 10 years, and we weren't doing a lot of outcome studies. We were doing mostly theoretical process measures. We were really in the basement and not very well known. For a reason, because we really wanted to do that first as a firm foundation before we went out there and said, hey, we've got something that is really useful. We did a few early randomized trials, make sure it was useful, mostly put them in the file drawer, not because they were bad, those successful ones, because we weren't ready. And then we worked on the theory and model and measures and so forth, and then finally, after about 15, 20 years, in 1999, published the first ACT book. But you're right, they overlap quite a bit. Now, the difference, though, is that in traditional CBT, there's a backup and notice so that you can challenge, dispute, and change. So detect, challenge, dispute, and change. You back up and notice thought records and so forth so that you can then do those next things. It's interesting that you get an early response to CBT in some people, that just backing up a notice, collecting a record, and doing some behavioral tests sometimes has very profound effects in depression and other areas. Why would it do that before you get to any cognitive change methods? Well, because diffusion linked to behavioral variability, and ideally linked to something that's of importance. I mean, in these tests, very often they're linked to something the person really wants to do. It can be pretty close to what they value. That's pretty acty. And so the difference is, I guess, that there's a vast number of methods in ACT for how to do diffusion that were never there in CBT, so there's a lot of technological development. Singing your thoughts, saying them in silly voices, writing them down, distilling them to a single word and saying them repeatedly, saying them in the voice of yourself as a young child, on and on and on it goes, right? So the diffusion methods, of which there's hundreds, almost none of those were in the CBT literature, because it was a first step of the therapeutic work was focused on cognitive change. In ACT, it may be the first, maybe not the first, but it's a very important step in and of itself in creating enough healthy distance that we can get emotional, attentional, and behavioral variability, healthy forms in the presence of these behaviorally dominating thoughts and verbal formulations. Also, the theory that's underneath ACT, relational frame theory, which is not just a theory, it's a vast research program, now can really walk out some of how this works with these transformations of stimulus functions and how to rein them in. And in traditional CBT, what was underneath the detecting of automatic thoughts was a much more common sense clinical theory of believing that cognitive errors and core schemas and so forth were problematic and needed to be changed. Now, it's not that cognitive change isn't in ACT, it is, but it's not in there in the same way. And so when you get deeper into ACT theory, you'll see that there's an overlap with virtually all of the deeper clinical traditions and many of the spiritual and religious traditions. It's its own tradition. It didn't come from any of one of those areas. It links to or laps with. And so I think that's a good thing. When you find that others are doing similar things and have for a long time, that should reassure you that there's probably something of importance here, and if we can add to that with additional work on processes of change, underlying theory, linking it to other things, the overall model, and so forth, technology, new methods of moving things, then we're making some progress. And I think, I hope it doesn't sound too arrogant, but I think the ACT work has been progressive. Do full-blown panic attacks still occur in your life? If so, how often? No, they don't. Waves happen. The last full-blown I had, but it was very short, was in the 1990s. I mean, it lasted 5 or 10 minutes. I paid with like 4 or 5 months of pain. I've told that story before. I was giving a talk in front of 12 really major people at a conference I'd organized, including Dave Barlow and a colleague, I think Terry Wilson was in the room. I mean, these monsters. And I'm this little, associate or full professor, but a little guy compared to the heroes I had around the room. And I had a wave of anxiety as I turned to sort of show an overhead. It was long enough ago. It was overheads. By my memory, it was around 91. Or 92, and I literally said in my own mind, no, like, I'm not going to let that happen here. And boy, I mean, within 60 seconds, I could hardly speak. I mean, that no posture immediately got me, and I turned and looked back at the screen in my overhead and found the place. I think people thought I was just pondering the slide. But I found that place to say, yes, okay, if that's what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen, and I'm not going to run from it. If I'm going to make a fool of myself, having a panic attack in front of course, I wouldn't have really made a fool of myself, but that's what my mind's saying, in front of my heroes, then that's what's going to happen. And the 4 or 5 months that followed, the have hell was then before every single talk, it was, you have to take a pill, you have to take a pill, you have to take a pill, you have to take a pill. I mean, it was like, where this ancient systems of trying to manage anxiety came back in full force. I've had anxiety waves that are not really panic attacks since, that invite me enough that I can see over the edge, and I actually welcome them. I'm glad I still have them, because I don't want to get arrogant about this. And it's kind of like, bring it on. I like that feeling of having to use your skills to show up. And in smaller ways than doing it every day. What's your opinion of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory? I like it. I mean, I think I'm interested in it, and I would like to see some combos with it. In fact, others are pursuing that. But I need to see actually more in the area of data and so forth. So if you're interested in it, you'll find others in the CBS community who are as well. I suggest you join ACBS. In your membership settings, you can then join the main listserv. And if you were to say, hey, what are people's opinion? Ask this question, you'll find like 30 people coming out of the woodwork who are doing work in this area. What do you say you need to have a certain, would you say you need to have a certain personality in order to be a good therapist? Can one tell if they'd be a good therapist before making a decision to follow that path? I don't think it's personality that's involved. For one thing, be a little cautious about that whole idea of personality. You know, if you know personality theory, they say there's big five, there's five, right? If you follow people within their lifetime across time and situations, and personality is supposed to be that which goes across time and situation, there's almost nobody who's any one of those fives across time and situation within the individual. I can actually show you those studies. So we've looked at across people at a given point in time. And then we invite, because of that, just like what we do with syndromes and disorders, for people to climb inside that clown suit. Next thing they're telling everybody, oh, I am a BPD, you know, etc. Oh, gosh, you know, or I am an extrovert. And that so rides over all the things that you are in all the situations. You're not always an extrovert. So be careful about that. But the other thing I would say is, what we know about therapy is that people who are able to bring psychological flexibility processes into their interactions with others, people who are able to be accepting, non-judgmental, present, focused, values-based, who will be there consciously in a real relationship, a real genuine conversation with other persons, and take the risk and be vulnerable for values purposes that are linked to that person's values and helping them develop good habits of values-based action. Those 6 things, I mean, if your heart is into it, if you see the sense of it, if you're willing to put enough of that into your way of being, to bring it into the room between you and others and to empower them on that journey, you're going to have good quality therapeutic relationships, and you'll be a good therapist if you link what you do to evidence-based methods that are linked to evidence-based processes. So do the personal work. Be committed to a values-based journey with others. Don't do it just because you're hoping it'll make you feel better about yourself. You feel good in being in a one-up position. Oh, no, that's a terrible way to, But if it's really more there to serve others in this way that is flexible and values-based, then that's enough. That's enough, I think, for you to be a good therapist in the way that fits who you are. There are lots of ways of being in the world, and within the individual across time, you may not be one of the big 5, but you are your own unique person. And let that shine in the therapy room, but in a way that's in the interests of the lives of those you serve. And every way of being that is pro-social and caring and loving and disciplined and where you've done the work, you've learned the methods, you're trying to be of aid. Every one of those will be of help, because what you bring to the table in the lives of others is something that will make a difference in the lives of others. So I hope those things are useful. I hope those answers to those questions make sense to you. And peace, love, and life.